welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. After the breakdown of the Hanoi summit, there's a flurry of symmetry among regional leaders. Are traditional allies joining forces? What drives their alignments? Today, we'll look at how the 6 countries are moving forward in efforts to denuclearize North Korea.
We'll also be talking about, by the way, North Korea, where we're working together very closely with others, and I think it's going pretty well.
I appreciate that Russia and China is helping us.
In the studio with me today, Ambassador James Zumwalt, CEO of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. Ambassador Zumwalt was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs and was responsible for policy toward Japan and Korea. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Snyder, let me begin with you. So after the breakdown of the Hanoi summit, the leaders of the 6 major stakeholders on the North Korean issue are holding a series of summits. So at this time, why are these countries eager to take part in this discussion?
Well, the Hanoi summit failure involves the security interests of all of the neighbors. And so I see a push factor and a pull factor related to engagement by neighbors in diplomacy with North Korea and the United States. And the pull factor is really North Korea trying to reach out to Putin for alternatives to diplomacy with the United States. And the push factor has been U.S. allies, South Korea and Japan, trying to make sure they understand what Trump has in mind and to make sure that the situation isn't going to go into an unexpected direction as a result of the summit failure.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, traditional allies are North Korea, China, and Russia, and U.S., Japan, and South Korea. And these traditional allies are increasing contacts, but at the same time, the leaders are not explicitly taking sides. For instance, President Putin says that the ultimate goal is denuclearization, same as the United States. And President Trump says Russia and China are helping in maintaining sanctions on North Korea. So how do you see the latest dynamics between the 6 countries?
No, I would agree with you that it's not a case of 3 countries on one side and 3 on the other. All of them have stakes in the situation, and from the perspective of the United States and South Korea, I think it's important to engage all of the regional players, China, Russia, Japan, because any long-term agreement to be viable and sustainable will require the support and the participation of all of these countries.
Mm-hmm. How do you see the dynamics?
Well, if we look at the decades since the 6-party talks were actually working and moving forward, I think that we've seen North Korea conducting 5 nuclear tests during that time, and we have seen a kind of unity of response with regards to denuclearization. And so actually all the major powers around North Korea are on the same page on that, but they have different perspectives on peace. And so the issue of how you get to peace and stability in and around the Korean Peninsula is where the differences are and where the potential sticking points in terms of cooperation on trying to achieve denuclearization could emerge.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador, did Chairman Kim receive cold shoulder from President Putin while he was visiting Russia?
I didn't see the summit in Vladivostok as a terribly significant event. I would call it, for President Putin, a drive-by summit. He was on his way to Beijing. And I think the North Koreans were disappointed with the lack of a joint statement or some Russian promises for additional assistance.
Mm-hmm. And President Xi is expected to visit both North and South Korea in June ahead of the 70th anniversary of the establishment of China. And would China's deeper involvement further complicate the current stalemate?
Well, I see China as having a lot of work to do in its relationship with both South Korea and North Korea. With North Korea, China is simply trying to signal that it has to be involved in events related to achievement of Korean peace. With South Korea, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of changing South Korean attitudes towards China post-THAAD retaliation. And so the real action is between the US and China. And so the question, I think, is how will the North Korea issue be dealt with between Trump and Xi, possibly in the context of or after the trade war ends?
And I think Scott raises a good point because the United States and China have a huge agenda of all kinds of issues. And potentially the North Korea problem is one area where there is some convergence of views and might be potentially a brighter spot. So I agree with Scott, if the United States and China, for example, can resolve or at least shelve their bilateral trade issues, the prospects for working together in concert with other countries on North Korea improve.
Now, Ambassador, during President Trump and Prime Minister Abe's latest summit, the two leaders agreed to maintain pressure and sanctions on North Korea. Do you think after the breakdown of the Hanoi summit, Japan has more room to persuade the United States to stay strong against North Korea?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that from Japan's perspective, the sanctions are a means to an end. They're not the ultimate objective. And recently, 2 weeks ago, the United States and Japan had our bilateral security consultative committee where the foreign and defense ministers met. And I think their statement was very clear. The ultimate objective is to see the end of North Korea's program of weapons of mass destruction and delivery systems. And until that objective is achieved, we will sustain the sanctions. So it's very clear that the sanctions are not the ultimate goal. And certainly I think Japan would be prepared in a process of moving toward denuclearization to consider various ways of lifting the sanctions. So I don't see a huge difference. There may be some tactical differences, but I don't see a strategic difference between the South Korea, US, and Japan on this issue.
And Mr. Snyder, what is your take on Prime Minister Abe's thinking on sanctions on North Korea?
I think the US and Japan are very much on the same page on sanctions enforcement. But now Abe has expressed interest in potentially meeting with Kim Jong-un. And so I think that creates a kind of limit on the possibility of expanding sanctions. Plus, President Trump has indicated that he's quite comfortable with where we are on the enforcement of sanctions. He doesn't seem to want to ramp up, possibly in contrast to the views of some of his closest advisors, like National Security Advisor Bolton.
And do you think if North Korea is more willing to talk with Prime Minister Abe, Japan may soften its stance on North Korea?
Well, there's certainly a possibility, and there was a very significant development in the recently, in that Prime Minister Abe announced that he's willing to meet with Kim Jong-un without preconditions. Previously, his position had been North Korea must resolve the abductee issue first, and then I will meet. So that is a significant shift, and I think may reflect his desire to have a senior level meeting. What he said was, I will meet and we should have sincere talks and I'll keep my mind open. That said, when they do meet, I'm sure he'll be pressing North Korea for progress on this issue of Japanese citizens who were abducted against their will to North Korea. But what he's saying is talks would have to come first. He recognizes a solution would come after talks.
So, Mr. Snyder, why is North Korea not very interested in meeting with Japan?
Well, the abduction issue is an incredibly difficult issue to try to grapple with. At the working level, there have been past failed efforts between Japan and North Korea to deal with this issue. On the other hand, interestingly enough, Kim Jong-un actually in some ways has a clean slate on this issue. And so if he can find a way to deal with this that might be different from that of his father, there could be some possibility. It's just that so far we've seen absolutely no momentum in that direction. And I think we've seen actually, I would say, a failure of imagination on the part of North Korean diplomacy in figuring out how to engage Japan in this process.
And that failure of imagination, Ambassador, when we look long term, there must be a role that Japan can play. So do you think there's a room that North Korea may get interested?
Yes, and I agree with you that long term, Japan will play a role if we're talking about a path toward a new peace and security regime that brings North Korea into the regional and international system. And there are two ways Japan will play a big role. One is if you look at the need North Korea has for investment in infrastructure, institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank potentially can play a big role. And Japan, as one of the largest shareholders in those institutions, has a huge say over decisions. So North Korea would certainly want Japanese support for that kind of international lending. But second, the Japanese have always hinted that should there be a resolution of the problems, that Japan is prepared to come in with, they don't call it reparations, but with large amounts of foreign assistance. People have looked at what Japan provided to South Korea in the 1960s as a benchmark, if you will. So I think the unstated role that Japan would play going forward is as an entity that finances needed investment. And so for that reason, I think for North Korea, there is an incentive at some point to bring Japan into the discussions because they want access to Japanese capital.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, President Trump is visiting Japan in May and June, and Prime Minister Abe is the leader that met with President Trump and talked with President Trump the most times. So do you think Prime Minister Abe's personal relationship has kept Japan's agenda in this denuclearization discussions?
Well, I think that Prime Minister Abe has had many opportunities to whisper into President Trump's ear on this issue, but the outcome has not always been what Prime Minister Abe has expected. And I think both in terms of engaging directly with Kim Jong-un and in terms of cutting back on U.S. exercises on the Korean Peninsula, Prime Minister Abe clearly was caught off guard. And so I think it's important. I think it's a right strategy for Prime Minister Abe to continue to stay close to President Trump, but we have to recognize that President Trump employs a strategy of uncertainty maximization as part of his diplomacy, and so as a result, others will be surprised.
Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of concerns about bilateral ties between Japan and South Korea, but we're expecting a defense trilateral talks in the near future. So would this talk help improve the trilateral coordination?
You're exactly right that from the perspective of the United States, we have been quite concerned about the deterioration in relations between South Korea and Japan. From our perspective, we have two allies in the region and we very much need to work together. In fact, the United States cannot meet its commitments to defend South Korea without access to bases in Japan. There are 9 bases in Japan that fly the UN flag because they're considered UN rear, part of the Korea contingency planning. So we very much need continued cooperation from Japan in order to meet our commitments to Korea. So the tensions between Japan and Korea are very awkward for us. I agree, though, that working level talks, these defense trilateral talks you mentioned, are very important. This is the 11th round of those talks, so they have continued despite the ups and downs in political relationship. On the U.S. side, it'll be Assistant Secretary Randy Shriver and Mark Napper from the State Department, who used to be chargé in Seoul, who'll be leading the U.S. team. They're very experienced. But I think their focus will be on practical issues. How can South Korea and Japan and the U.S. work together? Issues like enforcement of UN sanctions, for example. But I do think it's important to continue those practical talks. However, I would say they're not a substitute for improvement at the political level as well.
Now, Mr. Snyder, April 27th was the anniversary of the summit between President Moon and Chairman Kim. But Chairman Kim flew to Russia, and South Korea only celebrated by itself. And North Korea pulled their staff from the joint office and did not show up to joint celebrations for the past year. So did Chairman Kim only use President Moon to facilitate his meetings with other world leaders?
Well, I do think that Chairman Kim did use President Moon in order to reach out to other world leaders. And frankly, I think President Moon wanted to be used. And so that's not necessarily the issue. The issue is the fact that here we are on this anniversary and the South Korean side is celebrating alone. And I think that this just really exposes North Korean false intentions, both possibly with regard to denuclearization and also North Korea's continued focus on what I call the Uri Minjok strategy, of reaching out, the our nation together idea with South Korea and trying to pull, especially through its propaganda organs, South Korea away from the United States. And so that is a negative signal. It's problematic, I think, both for Moon and also for prospects for North Korea being more integrated with the world.
So, closing down our discussion, Ambassador, so we see a lot of symmetry, but not so much working level talks. So how can we bring North Korea back to the working level table?
Well, I don't know that we can bring North Korea back to the working level table. The way I would put it is if North Korea sends the working level officials to have serious discussions on many of the complex issues involved in denuclearization, that would be a signal that they're serious. If they choose not to send those officials, to me, that's a signal that they're not really serious.
I think this is exactly right. We need to see evidence of seriousness of purpose on the part of the North Koreans. There are two ways in which the North Koreans can reach out. One is through letters to President Trump, and the other, I think, is identified by Kim Jong-un in his Supreme People's Assembly speech, where he talks about the U.S. possibly engaging with the right attitude in a methodology that could lead to a third U.S.-North Korea summit. And of course, what the North Koreans have in mind might be different at this time from what the U.S. has in mind in terms of what the methodology is, but it gives space for, I think, a working level engagement that could try to shape the methodology that would be necessary in order to set up for a third summit.
We'll leave our discussion here and watch video for our next discussion.
Some 11 million people, or more than 40% of the population, lack sufficient nutritious food.
단 간부들은 힘들어요. 간부들만 힘들어하고 있어요.
The United Nations Food Security Assessment in North Korea found that following the worst harvest in 10 years, about 10 million people suffer from severe food shortages. The North Korean government is urgently requesting help from the international community. Now, Ambassador, the State Department points out that protracted humanitarian crisis is solely because of the North Korean government. What is your take?
Well, first of all, I would say that the photos and pictures of children who are suffering from malnutrition are very heart-rending, and a lot of Americans feel empathy toward people who are suffering in North Korea. So there's a natural desire to think, can we help? That, however, is also tempered with the knowledge that in the past it's been very difficult to work with the North Korean government to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches the intended targets, who are the children who are suffering. So I think there is going to be a willingness, this is not a new debate, there's going to be a willingness to consider humanitarian assistance, but a lot of skepticism about issues like monitoring of the program. So I think there are two conflicting impulses that you'll see reflected in the debate inside the State Department.
Mm-hmm. And Special Representative Began is expected to go to South Korea in the coming days and discuss the possible South Korean aid to North Korea amounting to $8 million US. So do you think this time Special Representative Began may give green light to South Korea to go ahead with the humanitarian aid?
I think it's possible that we may see a forward movement on that. This is a pledge that South Korea made in 2017, but they have not yet fulfilled. And in a way, the conditions have now developed that make it appropriate to potentially give humanitarian aid. But I think that the aid will be given through the international community, through the UN agencies, rather than bilaterally. And I think that we'll want to make sure that the aid is directed toward projects where the benefits are not fungible to other populations that are not at risk in North Korea.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, you've been with the State Department for 36 years. So what can you share with us regarding the internal debate regarding humanitarian aid to North Korea?
Well, I can recall, for example, in the 1980s, a lot of very similar discussion. There was a food crisis, should we provide humanitarian assistance, and skeptics. And interestingly, there was bipartisan support to try and work through the World Food Program, for example, to provide agricultural commodities that the World Food Program could use. And many on the Republican side cited President Ronald Reagan's comment that children who are suffering are not evil people. We should be helping those children despite political difficulties at the political level.
And Mr. Snyder, during the North Korea Freedom Week, the defectors came to the DC and they said that those North Korean people that they talked to, 9 out of 10, ordinary people are not suffering from international sanctions. Only the elites are suffering from international sanctions because they don't have access to 장마당, whereas ordinary people do. So is this a show, does this show that the targeted sanctions on the elites are working now?
Well, I'm personally skeptical about that claim because I believe that the elites have also invested in one form or another in the markets in North Korea. Another way of thinking about this is that if you are a tonju, if you're someone who has money, what allows you to be able to keep money? It's going to be connections with elites. And also elites are the ones who have hard currency. And so they're going to be the ones who are least affected by any contraction in the markets or price rises in the markets.
So now that North Korea is in a very difficult situation in the worst harvest in 10 years, does this put North Korea in a more vulnerable situation in the face of the international sanctions?
Well, this is the first test of this sort under Kim Jong-un. And I do think that sanctions make it more difficult for North Korea to use hard currency in order to buy food from abroad. And yet under Kim Jong-un, we've actually seen North Korea invest in that to some degree. And so I think what the State Department is saying, and what we would hope, is that the North Koreans would invest their resources in the most wise way to protect the people, rather than misdirecting investments in military-related programs.
And Ambassador, you did mention about Japan's possible economic package to North Korea, but could we also expect Japan providing humanitarian aid to North Korea?
I think that Japan will be reluctant to provide, certainly not direct aid, but even through the United Nations, I think Japan would like first to see some progress on the abductee issue. Were there some progress in that area, even, for example, an agreement to a joint investigation or some interim step, I think then you might see Japan contributing to a UN appeal.
On a final note, whichever country provides humanitarian aid to North Korea, what should be the ground rules?
Well, the first thing we really need in North Korea is an identification of greatest need. And I do think that this round aid will be done multilaterally. There's a lot of aid fatigue out there. The UN is having a hard time raising this money. And I would say that the UN Security Council resolutions, the panel of experts, have also tried to open up a pathway for the humanitarian assistance that is needed to be able to get through.
We'll end our conversation here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a picture of a rally in front of the presidential Blue House to ask the South Korean government block the repatriation of 7 North Korean defectors recently arrested in Shenyang, China. The youngest of the 7 defectors is a 9-year-old girl, and her mother joined in this rally and pleaded Seoul's help. Mr. Snyder?
Well, I think there's been a lot of concerns about, under progressive administrations, the willingness of the South Korean government to stand up for human rights. And so this is a case that has come up before the international community where there's an expectation that the South Korean government will take a little bit more forward-leaning stand. And we'll have to see what the result of that effort to put pressure on the South Korean government is.
When I saw this photo, the first thing I thought of was what a wonderful symbol of Korean democracy. We have people who have convictions and they're concerned about their government stance, and so they're stating their views as a way of inducing change in the government, and that's what democracy is all about.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mr. Snyder, Ambassador Zumwalt, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.